Okay, so on to some media studies. What is Media Archaeology by Jussi Parikka? Might be UC. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I think I'm pretty confident with Parikka. But before then, chores. This can all be found on Spotify, iTunes, or Podbean, which I will put links in the description for. And also Patreon account for anyone who's interested, because I'd really like to be able to cover the cost of the servers for the podcast, which is like $12 a month. So if you can, that'd be cool. If not, don't worry about it. And I feel bad asking, but gotta do it. All right, so what is media archaeology? Now, this book kind of falls into the camp of what is called new materialisms within media studies, and that is looking at the way in which traditional question about materiality, that is dealing with things in a very, I will say, in a very brazen way or very vulgar way. Material, that is the desk I'm currently touching or the pen I hold or anything like that. Things that exist in the world, essentially. Now, for media archaeologists and other kind of media studies folks, this begs some important questions. Where does materiality end and things like software begin? Or are those two things the same? Because when we're dealing with software, we have to admit that we're dealing with something that is pretty well immaterial, but has a kind of material base with the hardware that kind of subtends it. So with that kind of preface, we'll move into Parikka's preface, that is his introduction here, titled Cartographies of the Old and the New. And he begins this by giving the example of steampunk. So for those that aren't familiar, steampunk is a kind of aesthetic move, and it is political, that tries to reimagine the kind of aesthetic flavor of the early 20th century, late 19th century around industrialization. So this is realized in like dress to video games to movies to anything like this that try to reimagine a past that has ostensibly gone away, that has ostensibly disappeared. So he uses this as an example to imagine what media archaeology is trying to do. That is, for him, it is trying to look at the past of media, whatever kind of form they assume. And that's one of the big points, is that media, for Parikka and other thinkers in this field, is a very broad term, right? We aren't just thinking about it in terms of the news or new technology with like, iPhones or Androids or anything like that. Really, media in this sense comes from or is used in the way that the kind of preeminent media theorist Harold Innis set it out to be, and that is really anything. Now, that might seem like a kind of a strange claim, like how could anything be media? Well, according to Harold Innis, anything is media because anything in a given society or kind of cultural framework tells us a lot, and it tells us a lot about that society or that framework. So naturally, that presents some problems because it's difficult if we take everything to be media and we want to look at everything in that way, then it's difficult for us to really craft out a steady identity for media, whether that identity be its kind of ontological character, like what is it, how it moves through time and space, or anything like that. So what Parikka is trying to show here is that media archaeology does not shy away from those troublesome questions. And by asking those questions, what it tries to do is dissuade us from simply believing that media have developed kind of teleologically, that is, in a kind of sequential, clear way, or positively, that is, has been getting more efficient and better and all that, and instead asks us to rethink the way that we imagine that, to imagine lost media, to imagine media that hasn't been created yet, which, I'm really setting up what the whole book is doing, but yeah. So one of the big figures that Parikka locates in this field is Foucault. So Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and historian, who doesn't really fit into a media studies framework all that smoothly. Any media studies people out there might be confused, but let me explain. Foucault never really talks about media per se. He does in the kind of Innis-like sense. That is, he talks about institutions and artifacts in a society and uses them to understand that society, but he never really talks about them as media. However, Parikka doesn't think that there's nothing that can be taken from Foucault. Instead, Parikka asks, what is that we can learn from Foucault's teachings, that is, his discourses around power, knowledge, our obsession with history? What can those ideas tell us about even our fascination with media and how we obsessively try to, dissect it and unpack it to find its history? So for Parikka, he tries to understand the way that various media can give us a glimpse of a time past, or not so much past, but very much present, and also the kind of implications of that very process. So in this way, media archaeology for Parikka has made headway in the discussions of modernity, of cinema, histories of the present, and alternative histories. And he goes through each of those specifically. So beginning with modernity, he says that essentially modernity had birthed, or has birthed, new technology and new ways to essentially look at the past, because it is in modernity that we see the emergence of museums. The second here, cinema. So cinema essentially opened up new discussions on the act of viewing. So this was especially true when it came to studies of voyeurism or studies of kind of spectacle, or in the case of gender, like the male gaze. And it also opened up discussions of the third one here, histories of the present. That is, it troubles the idea of the new, revealing that to do history says more about ourselves, or more about ourselves in the present than it actually does about the past. Because, and this was, in my mind, one of the great insights of Foucault, is that to do history was a very strange thing, where he says that, and this isn't verbatim, but there was a weird transition when nature, we began to look at nature historically, and in that process, history itself became natural. Now, number 4, how it opens up discussions of alternative histories, because it essentially reveals different perspectives on media, or of media, which essentially troubles teleology. But in a proper kind of interdisciplinary way, Parikka doesn't want to just limit this discussion to like kind of rigorous theoretical, discussion. But instead is interested in the way that media archaeology is happening, not just in academia, and the rest of this book will come to show this, but in art and in practice and on the web and all these different places where people are constantly disrupting the flow of media in a very clear, smooth way, pointing to its limits and presenting new alternatives. And that puts us here into the first chapter, Media Archaeology of the Senses, Audiovisual, Affective, and Algorithms. Or Audiovisual Affective Algorithms, sorry. So for Parikka, he identifies at the beginning of this chapter that media archaeology was essentially birthed out of what was called New Film history, which essentially sought to understand, quote, the worlds of experience, memory, aesthetics, and politics. Now, anyone familiar with film history would know that that is essentially what, or film analysis or film studies, would know that that is what essentially the process is. But Parikka adds to this to suggest that what makes media archaeology different is not only that it looks at more of a vast array, it's more eclectic, it moves beyond film. Parikka is also interested in the way that media archaeology opens up a discussion about the affective dimension, that is the relationship between the user, or the observer, or the engager, and the medium itself. And this kind of corresponds to an opening up of the senses in this discussion. That is how the senses have a kind of dynamic interplay with the medium. So the very way that we engage with new media has some kind of an effect on who we are as people. And this isn't a totally outlandish claim. The way that we are engaging with our technology today is very different than it was 30 years ago. I mean, even 20 years ago, before the internet was like in everyone's homes, the thought of being able to access information from home was very different. So that opens up a discussion about the way that even how we organize our lives and how our bodies interact with one another has been affected by these media. So the definition that he provides of affect is as follows, and it shouldn't be mixed up with emotion, because emotion implies more of a kind of simply brain-like phenomenon, doesn't deal so much with the senses or the kind of bodily affect, that is how the body actually changes. So for him, it kind of affect represents the, quote, material stuff of multisensorial, kinesthetic, pre-conscious capacities and thresholds. So the recognition of these various thresholds came about, according to Parikka, from 19th century physiology, experimental psychology, and a variety of scientific and experimental measures that made humans more aware about what was going on in their bodies in ways that, we couldn't necessarily control, that we could only really identify, but that nevertheless made us aware of all the mechanisms going on underneath the skin, that is. So if we accept that media can give us a glimpse into how societies are formed, and then if we can accept that media alter the way that, and this shouldn't make it seem as though there's kind of pre-mediated bodily condition, right, that, can be essentially unearthed. We are always already affected by media. So if we can accept that media can give us a glimpse into a societal condition, and we can accept that media alter the way that people exist in the world at a bodily affective dimension, then therefore by analyzing media through this approach, this media archaeological approach, we can learn lots about not only society, but humans themselves. So for those familiar with the film Ex Machina, there's a moment in it when the scientist is explaining that he's kind of uncovered the code to the human brain. And he explains that this wasn't so much a discovery for us to learn what people were thinking, but it was a discovery to teach us how people were thinking, which is much more of an important question. Because if you just learn the content of what people think, it doesn't tell you very much about, the apparatuses that make that content possible, which is what I think exactly what Parikka is getting at here in the hopes of media archaeology. But here we get a problem, and that is the problem presents itself because humans aren't only affected by what they perceive, according to Parikka, which is kind of an interesting claim. He adds that it is also all the things that kind of subtend what we perceive. That is, if I'm looking at a computer screen, there's a lot going underneath the hood that affects us in very clear ways. So we think here of algorithms, we think of software, we think of codes that have effects on us that we aren't necessarily privy to. So and this kind of opens up a discussion that will be built throughout the course of the book, but that one of the other tasks of media archaeology is to recognize these other kind of sub-perceptive mechanisms that are operating so that we can have a better understanding of, who we are. So not just by looking at media as it presents itself to everyone, but at the operations that exist underneath it, which has a kind of relationship to, the political economists or even to the Marxist approach that wants to look at what makes any kind of development possible, which I think is a noble task. But here we move on to Chapter 3, imaginary media, that is mapping weird objects. So this chapter begins with, the presentation of a certain artwork, and I regret that I'm going to give a bad description of it because I'm not an art historian or art critic or anything like that, and I definitely recommend you just look it up if you're on a computer, but it's called parallel image, and in this image there's a kind of computer and then a whole slew of wires coming out of the computer that are connected up to like a kind of template, a kind of blank canvas of sorts, and those wires create an image on the one side. So it goes from kind of code to image. So this might be understood as a kind of archaic example of the kind of dissemination of media, or the dissemination of code that essentially form media, because it's cumbersome, it's a big thing, and it does a singular simple operation that is essentially depict this one image. So this artwork for Parikka prompts two questions, or two kind of observances. And the first one is, which technology is considered worthy historically, and why? And then number two, it forces a new relation between art and the viewer. So to kind of open up the first a little bit, so that is which tech is considered worthy and why, Parikka is trying to ask why that technology didn't make it. Why was it essentially foreclosed? And I feel like I have to preface this by saying that he's not overly clear about the mechanisms that actually go on, the kind of political or socioeconomic forces that make this possible. Throughout the course of the book, he's calling for that, but he's kind of leaving it for a later date, like someone else can take that up. For now, he's just essentially posing the questions. And then number two here, it forces new relation between art and the viewer, because it's not necessarily something that anyone really wants to see, and it troubles the idea of us having a very smooth connection with our media, with our technology. Troubling, technology being this amazing, life-altering, essentially way to make life easier or expedite everything. Now, this is kind of an example of an imaginary media for Parikka, because imaginary media are either media that have disappeared, so once existed and disappeared, or have yet to exist. And they are being imagined in various zones. Like in this case, it's in an art gallery, but we could just think of this in so many other different ways. It's not reserved to these kind of specific zones like art galleries. So what this imaginary media provokes, or it kind of allows, is the development of the faculties to be able to recognize new forms of materiality, which is kind of necessary because, as the problem I raised earlier with software, it would appear as though we don't at this moment have the kind of capacity to recognize software as material. So by developing our capacity for that through our imagination, we can open up a very interesting discussion about it. So in the case of imaginary media, a little bit more specifically, he wants to kind of apply a Foucauldian perspective to it. That is, he wants to ask what kind of mechanisms of power and control have determined what media gets made and what media has been forgotten. Now, this relates more broadly to the idea of the archive found in the Archaeology of Knowledge, one of Foucault's texts. So, thank God for us, Parikka actually gives us a kind of quick synopsis of the key points in that book. But if you want more about it, I did an episode on here with a friend of mine on the Archaeology of Knowledge, which you can go check out. It's available on all the other platforms too. But what Parikka tells us about the Archaeology of Knowledge here, it's through 4 points, and let me just begin by saying. Number 1, archaeology is monumental. So that is to say that it does not look at what is behind a discourse, and does not try to interpret it by referring to something outside the discourse. It is focused on the fact that something is a monument. Okay, number 2, archaeology focuses on the specificity of the discourse and not on establishing a continuity and transition. Number 3, archaeology works outside disciplines and normal boundaries of knowledge, such as oeuvres. Number 4, archaeology and its conception of the archives do not point to origins, secret, or obvious, but are interested in rewriting practices and systematic description of a discourse object. So it's fairly clear, trying to disrupt what are considered traditional modes of knowledge acquisition through history or anything like that, to disrupt that and to ask, why do we have this obsession? Why do we locate certain kind of specific authority in specific domains? Why do we locate value in certain places? And by kind of doing this, we begin to expand our understanding of not only monuments, as it's described through Foucault, but what counts as, monuments in terms of media. Like, what are media that we can actually learn stuff from? So by presenting new media that we can learn stuff from, we kind of re-enter new media onto the scene, or media that has once been forgotten. So this allows us not only to imagine alternative pasts, that is, pasts that have been forgotten, but it opens up the door for, coming out of another thinker's kind of lexicon, alternative histories for Parikka. And that other thinker was Zielinski, which I hope I didn't mispronounce. And one of the super interesting implications of this is described by Parikka in terms of the psychoanalytic dimension that he wants to kind of move away from to some extent, because he doesn't just want to reduce this to what he calls a kind of Lacanian triad between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. So we aren't thinking about the imaginary in that way. But he still says something rather interesting, and it goes like this. Just like the phonograph already proved to do. So hence, imaginary media of rays affecting the nerves, hallucinations, and delusions are a way of understanding the link to the new psychoanalytic understanding of the body. So he continues a little later on. In such a material version, then, the weird bodies of modernity, insane and otherworldly, are less hallucinations than part of the material logic of discourse networks. So it seems as though almost by looking at these imaginary media, we can get a glimpse at, various strange ailments that seem to evade us. But unfortunately, that's an idea that he kind of throws out there but doesn't really expand upon, which I thought was super interesting. But still, I guess we can chew on that for a while if we want. So I should say that throughout the course of this book, a lot of times it feels like a lit review. Like he's presenting a lot of different ideas, or many different ideas from many different people, but I have avoided going into each one of their specific kind of outlooks because it would just take so long. And I'm sure anyone who's familiar with this channel, you're very much familiar with that fact that I try to give a more concise presentation, not diverging too far from the kind of original text. But on that note, here we'll propel ourselves into chapter 4. That is media theory and new materialism. So when we think of materialism in terms of computers, we might not initially think of software, right? We'd probably initially think of hardware, the actual material that makes up the computer. So he says that hardware theory, so apparently that's a field or an approach, essentially wants to identify new forms of media that aren't considered as such, right? That aren't considered media proper. So what do those look like? Well, and it's here I'm actually going to present one of the key figures in this text, which I just said I wouldn't do, but there are a couple that I think are important to mention, and that is Kittler. So this is Friedrich Kittler, I believe. For Parikka, Kittler essentially does two things. Number one, he, quote, looked at old media such as literature as media systems for transmitting, linking, and institutionalizing information, which relates to that idea from Harold Innis that I presented earlier. So relating to this hardware theory idea that is expanding the domain of possibility to new media. Number two, he argued how power works in the age of technical media. So there he's taking from a Foucauldian approach. So Kittler gives us the idea of discourse networks that Parikka says can be found anywhere, right, in any kind of media. And discourse networks are essentially where power resides. So by looking at networks of discourse, it can be revealed, who wields power against whom, and for whom is that power essentially working for. So for Kittler, he kind of traces the power, right? He says the power can be found in what he calls science and military contexts as the kind of zones through which these various media are controlled in these discourse networks to be better mobilized in the service of the few, in the service of few institutions. So media archaeology, for Parikka, coming back to his term, is the process by which this is recognized. So recognized through both software, as in the course of a kind of abstract, immaterial discourse, and hardware. So new materialism does this in that it looks at software as though it itself is material, right? So algorithms, codes, software can be traced, can be seen, can be understood. Therefore, we shouldn't just disavow it. And then it's from there that he pushes us into chapter 5, that is mapping noise and accidents. So with this chapter, he begins by looking at Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, where Parikka says that Benjamin was essentially performing a kind of excavation of waste, rubble, and ruins. That is, the waste, rubble, and ruins of modernity and the emergence of capitalism as a, terrible force for Benjamin. But actually not that terrible, because he said capitalism will bring about the means for its own end. So he's very Marxist in that way. So then this chapter is interested in the way that virus, spam, and fraudsters work in relation to hardware and software, and how they point to the limits of the possibilities of hardware and software, and how noise, a kind of feedback that can never be totally mitigated or removed, kind of always shows the imperfectibility of software, hardware, technology. But this noise is not reduced to technology alone. It can be found in the body. So in the case of the gramophone, it was found that it picked up not only the meaning inherent in human speech, but just as effectively the whispers, the noises of the body, the extras of communication, so to speak, that come with every opening of the mouth, which as soon as you're privy to listening to me talk, you hear all the noises that accompany any discussion, be it other noises from my mouth that I'm not purposefully making, noises from my annoyingly squeaky chair, or the pen that's probably flicking around in my hand. All of these things you become aware of, and as soon as you become aware of it, then you can't really turn them off. Then they kind of take over the show. Or my elbow hitting against the desk, they kind of take over the show. Now, no matter how much I try to get rid of that, they'll always be there to some extent, because the case of the mouth is really the best one. Whenever I open my lips, there's always that kind of residual sound, which is so annoying. And even myself, when I've been made aware of it, I hate it so much. But yeah, sorry, I digress. But to really hit the point home, Parikka suggests that this extends much further than the body itself, or media, suggesting that stochastic processes and Brownian random motion at the molecular level suggested that the universe consisted primarily of processes that were unstable, noisy. So it seems like it's unavoidable. So what does it tell us? Evidently not a whole lot in and of itself, but the response to it was very interesting. So this moves us into the idea of cybernetics. So cybernetics emerging in the kind of early 20th century, but has its roots back way to the Greeks, where the term cyber, I think, comes from the name of a person that steered a ship or rowed a boat, controlled the oar or the steering column or whatever there's a word, but it's evading me. Essentially the controller of something. So cybernetics kind of sought to do away with the noise, right? So when we think of cybernetics, for those familiar with that whole field, we might think of the Macy Conference in the 50s, with some key figures like Norbert Wiener or Newman or Alan Kay, even as all these kinds of figures that were interested in the kind of interaction between humans and machines, which opened up a number of interesting questions about what it means to be a human. But to kind of bar those for now, human and machines would come together to move towards a kind of perfectibility. Now that's specific here to Norbert Wiener. So as Parikka writes, cybernetics in its attempt to provide solutions for controlling noise was inherently tied to the idea of noise as disorganization, Wiener's early interest in Brownian movement also suggests how cybernetics can be characterized as an archival task of inclusion via exclusion. So much of cybernetics was based on the realization that the universe is probabilistic and only metastable. There is no ultimate possibility of getting rid of the intervening effects of noise, as it is a basic feature of the physical world, but there are always ways to examine, map, and constrain that noise. So the term noise then, Parikka uses it to go beyond just noise as it's been described so far, to think of any kind of disruption itself as noise. So he then begins to think about the telegraph, or the sending of information across airwaves that was open to interception, which was a big problem, right, in World War II when, you could send a message out and it could very well be intercepted by your enemy that could do God knows what they want with it. So the telegraph was meant to kind of dissuade that possibility because, it's essentially wireless. Like, these are radio signals flying through the air. But then it was quickly found out that, you just tune into the right frequency and you can catch that information. So as things became more wireless, what maybe at one point someone thought would be a way to kind of reduce noise, actually opened up the door for more noise, because then people who didn't actually have, the kind of knowledge that came with the kind of military education or higher academic understanding, these people, anyone could kind of hop on with like a home radio or anything like that onto these frequencies and essentially acquire information or just clog up the airwaves with their own crap that, made it so it was that much more difficult to have a clean, noise-free channel. Which was a good thing because it opened up the possibility for more people in a kind of democratic way to be able to engage on these airwaves, and how it wasn't just, exclusively for those people that had the authority. So then in this case, noise, because noise was kind of the sound of common people, of the regular people using these airwaves, it allowed a kind of new perspective to emerge, so that it wasn't just, those people in authority that could say what they wanted to say. Now, as far as the study of media goes, this opens up a kind of radical potential, because as long as people have been doing media studies, that it goes back beyond, like, earlier than the 19th century, even, up till now, most of the time these things were being written, that is, the things being studied, written by the people that had power, people that had authority, people that can control or had monopolies over the production of knowledge, to use a term, one of Harold Innis's terms. So it was always biased as to what we would actually see, right? Whereas now the kind of noise we are presented with opens up kind of possibility, because this noise is now being spoken by the average person, so to speak. And then from there, we propel into chapter 6, that is archive dynamics, software culture, and digital heritage. So the archive traditionally was a kind of storage point for culture, right? It stored culture, and it was through that we could actually get a glimpse into that culture. But today, the archive is kind of difficult to see, because is Facebook an archive? Is it the software that portends it, that subtends it? Is it Twitter? Is it the cell phone? What is an archive? I don't know if anyone's written that text yet. Another, like a nice little 10-page thing. What is an archive? To, blow the world of archive studies apart. But if maybe it's written, I don't know. I haven't Googled it. But because software and the hardware that, supposedly underwrites it serve as bad archives because they're so ephemeral, right? They disappear all the time. That is more, peculiar to software than it is hardware. But nevertheless, and Parikka goes into has a whole thing about how, what is considered, I guess, traditional art, like an actual work of art, has to be like renewed and rejuvenated and revitalized. And there's another word, has to be upkept in order so that it doesn't completely deteriorate. There's another word, but I'm stupid. So even hardware goes through this kind of process. But because most of what we do on a computer or phone or anything is in relation to the software, then that is more of a place that we should expect to see the archive. But it's always disappearing. So where does that really leave us for recognizing it as an archive? Well, to kind of understand this, he then turns to a thinker by the name of Wendy Chun, who I happen to like a lot, and I've been meaning to do her book on here, one of her books, Software and Memory, on here for a while, but I just haven't gotten to it, where Chun gives the explanation that software kind of earns its endurance, or it earns its kind of longevity precisely through its ephemerality, precisely through the fact that it is always fleeting, because it never just disappears. It is always followed with a kind of revitalization, like a phoenix, right? And it is by virtue of that that it almost sets itself up to go on for a very, very, very long time, because it kind of built into its very logic is its own collapse. Whereas other forms of media, if they collapse, that's it. So this, and I've written some of my, peer-reviewed work is about this, like locating this notion of software with capitalism, because capitalism is a very effective system that, according to Marx, is one that, continuously tries to revitalize itself and actually makes use of various failures, various crises to propel itself forward. So I see a similarity here in the way that software allows that, and it is through that it can actually seem to last for a long time, like an archive. But when we talk about it in this way, like, I don't mean it like, oh, when a tweet is deleted, there's always one out there to replace it. I mean this in the way that whenever you click a video to play, you are simultaneously killing that video as well as, revitalizing it, because it's meant to be played, and it's being meant to be played. It's meant to kind of have a self-destructive component to it, but that is always being revitalized by its being played over and over and over again. So the archive then is kind of focused on software underneath the appearance level, what Parikka calls the constellation of material information, which can be traced to a kind of hardware type base, but that itself is also open to deterioration. So then he gives the example of what's called fundus, which is a museum archive or kind of display that just displays, and you should look it up, a bunch of old kind of technology on shelves and stuff. And the point of this is to demonstrate, how much technology has changed and developed and altered, and how it hasn't had a very smooth, clear, linear history. But to this, I have a criticism. Or it's not so much a criticism, but I feel like it's something that Parikka should consider. Where it feels like to me, what those, art exhibits are doing is more than just kind of pointing to the limits of our understanding of hardware or software for that matter. But they also kind of make us feel good about ourselves, because they always position these things in the kind of past. Because that is exactly what the function of a kind of museum-like space is to put these things in the past. Which makes us think that we are always already in the superior moment. Because if there was something that was actually quote-unquote superior, we would expect it wouldn't be in the art exhibit, it would be with us. So it kind of serves a kind of self-fulfilling function in that it maintains the position of those obsolescent media, hardware, in that space, while affirming why things exist out in, the popular mediascape. But yeah, that's just my thing. Anyways, from there on to chapter 7, that is practicing media archaeology, creating or creative methodologies for remediation. So this chapter, I was kind of fighting with myself as to how I should talk about it, because it just presents a lot of examples, really. But there are some key points that I'm going to bring up, and I'm only going to make reference to one or two kind of art pieces that Parikka mentions, because, if you're on listening to this as a podcast, or you don't have the opportunity to look it up, it'll be alienating. So I'm going to bar that and just kind of hope, you'll read it at some point, or you'll get the sense of what I'm talking about just through words alone. So what media archaeology is meant to do, this is a kind of reiteration of what's already been said, is to essentially critique media by creating media. That's media archaeological art, I should say, which serves the purpose of challenging the linear narrative of technology. So there are 6 fundamental ways, according to Parikka, for us to recognize what art is media archaeology, media archaeological art. And they go as follows. So number 1, artistic works that visually engage with historical themes is one way to do it. So like the example of steampunk that the book began with, or any kind of like lost or time that's passed. Number 2, invoking alternative histories, which are able to offer critical insights into the assumed natural state of digitality, whether technological or social, through the art piece that goes against the grain in terms of the materials it uses or the narratives of use. So the ones that, trouble the idea that the tech we have is the only way we could have developed them, or that, we've naturalized, in this case, the digital as, the form of tech. Number 3 here, art of or from obsolescence, that is pieces and practices that use obsolescent materials and solutions to engage with emerging media cultures, or just investigate the potentials in reusing and hacking electronic media. So for example, let's say you were to connect an iPhone up to an old like Commodore 64 monitor, so you could do everything you were doing on the iPhone to this. You probably wouldn't be able to do that, but let's take an old kind of monitor that, would support this possibility, like Windows 98 monitor or something, to like an iPhone 10 or whatever they're up to now. Plug it in so that through that monitor you are able to do everything you want on the phone, right? A kind of play on the phone itself, where you could say, well, this does the exact same thing, and you just lose the portability. But anyways, yeah. So number 4. If it invokes imaginary media that are constructed and not just imagined, devices that are dead or were never built, being reconstructed and reemployed for the curiosity value, but also to investigate the nature of progress, change, and the novelty-obsessed technological culture that is still, however, embedded in planned obsolescence. So planned obsolescence being, having a very clear affinity with late capitalism, when, shoes are designed to die in 3 years so that you go out and buy more. And this isn't necessarily like plotted out by people. If you buy shitty resources at the lowest possible cost, of course it will only last a short amount of time, and then your users will have to, or your consumers will have to go back and buy more. Now number 5, media archaeological art that draws from concrete archives. In other words, artistic practice informed by archival work and historical materials. A direct way of working like a historian, but for artistic ends. And then number 6 here, media archaeological art methods that dig not only into the past, but also include the machine and address the present, but technically archaeological, buried conditions of our media culture. So fair enough, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So then again, to kind of reiterate, media archaeology is interested in material. Software is material, hardware is material, in some cases culture is material, and that through this it disturbs temporality, right? Or it opens up questions of temporality, like whose history gets told? How is that history told in a linear way? Why is it told in such a linear way? Whose history are we forgetting in this process? And so on and so forth. And then finally here, we move into chapter 8, which is just the conclusion, which is very much a rehashing of what was discussed. But there's one point that I want to elaborate on. Or I should say the title of the chapter, that is Media Archaeology in Digital Culture. And the point that I want to emphasize here is when he actually talks about new materialities, which is kind of the key field that this belongs to. And that's on page here. Sorry, should have had it queued. Where we get 3 materialities. And they are as follows. So we get the materialities of cultural practice, that is of human activity, as embedded in both cognitive and affective apperceptions, appreciations, and investments, but also embodied phenomenological accounts of what we do when we invent, use, and adapt media technologies. So that was discussed at the very beginning. We're dealing with the affective dimension. And Black Mirror serves as a really fantastic example of that for anyone that's familiar with that show. Now, number 2 here, we have materialities of material, which he says sounds like a tautology, or kind of, solipsistic phrase, but that points to how we think of the constitutive non-humans that also, to riff off Bruno Latour, are part of what we call the social. So media history is a long story of experimenting with different materials, from glass plates to chemicals, from selenium to coltan. What is more, such materials have their after effects, nowadays most visible in the amount of e-waste we are leaving behind from our electronic culture. So, e-waste or other kind of, the landfill in the, I don't know if it was found, I think it was, the landfill in New Mexico or somewhere, of all the ET, NES, I think it was NES, whatever it was, games, that says a lot. Like, this material says a lot about our culture, like the culture of pure waste. Like Thorstein Veblen, the early 20th century sociologist, thinker, philosopher, really predicted this. The growing of wealth, we will waste much more. And it is through this waste that we actually affirm our wealth. And then number 3, we have materialities of technologies, which is media theoretical accounts such as Kittler's that have been instrumental in pushing us to media-specific analyses. So this has meant digging into how technologies work and finding structures of power through a technological analysis. So media archaeology is, for theorists such as Ernst, reverse engineering. So looking back looking back to culture through these media. And that, for the most part, I think gets at the essence of this book. I think I might have gone through it pretty quickly, but it's a smooth read. It's like it serves a pedagogical function. Like, for anyone that has read it, each chapter has a little summary at the end, which is nice. But hardcore purists out there would be like, no, you can't do that, because then you're gonna lose the essence. But it's great because we don't all have time to go and read like full books, like I do, and that's why I do this. But yeah, if you liked what you heard here, tell me why. I'd like to hear it. If you didn't like what I did here, I'd like to know why.